Have you ever wanted to get tips from an old master such as John Singer Sargent? He is one of the top 10 portrait artists of all time. In this video, one of Sargent's students gives us a peek into this master's process. Miss Heyman was just that student. She recalls her lessons with Sargent and shares them with us. I have been painting for a long time, and there is wisdom and history throughout the story. So let's take a look and learn from the master himself, along the way.
Welcome to the Sunday Painter. Please click and subscribe, hit the like button, and don't forget the little bell so you will be the first when we have an inspirational idea. Leave a happy creative comment.
Miss Heyman's recounting of Sargent's methods. When he first undertook to criticize Miss Heyman's work, he insisted that she should draw from models and not from friends. If you paint your friends, they and you are chiefly concerned about the likeness. You can't discard a canvas when you please and begin anew. You can't go on indefinitely until you have solved a problem. He disapproved, Miss Heyman continues, of my palette and brushes. On the palette the paints had not been put out with any system. You do not want dabs of color, you want plenty of paint to paint with. Then the brushes came in for derision. No wonder your painting is like feathers if you use these. Having scraped the palette clean, he put out enough paint so it seemed for a dozen pictures. Painting is quite hard enough without adding to your difficulties by keeping your tools in bad condition. You want good thick brushes that will hold the paint and that will resist in a sense the stroke on the canvas. He then with a bit of charcoal placed the head with no more than a few careful lines over which he passed a rag, so that his was a perfectly clean grayish colored canvas, which he preferred, faintly showing where the lines had been. Then he began to paint. At the start he used sparingly a little turpentine to rub in a general tone over the background and to outline the head, the real outline where the light and shadow meet, not the place where the head meets the background, to indicate the mass of the hair and the tone of the dress. The features were not even suggested. This was a matter of a few moments. For the rest he used his color without a medium of any kind, neither oil, turpentine or any other mixture. The thicker you paint, the more color flows. He had put in this general outline very rapidly, hardly more than smudges, but from the moment that he began really to paint, he worked with a kind of concentrated deliberation, a slow haste so to speak, holding his brush poised in the air for an instant and then putting it just where and how he intended it to fall. To watch the head develop from the start was like the sudden lifting of a blind in a dark room. Every stage was a revelation. For one thing, he often moved his easel next to the sitter so that when he walked back from it he saw the canvas and the original in the same light, at the same distance, at the same angle of vision. He aimed at once for the true general tone of the background, of the hair, and for the transition tone between the two. He showed me how the light flowed over the surface of the cheek into the background itself. At first he worked only for the middle tones, to model in large planes, as he would have done had the head been an apple. In short, he painted as a sculpture models, for the great masses first, but with this difference that the sculptor can roughly lump in his head and cut it down afterwards, while the painter, by the limitations of his material, is bound to work instantly for an absolute precision of mass, in the color and outline he intends to preserve. Economy of effort in every way, he preached, the sharpest self-control, the fewest strokes possible to express a fact, the least slapping about of purposeless paint. He believed, with Carolus Duran, that painting was a science which it was necessary to acquire in order to make of it an art. You must draw with your brush as readily, as unconsciously almost as you draw with your pencil. He advised doing a head for a portrait slightly under life size, to counteract the tendency to paint larger than life. Even so he laid in a head slightly larger than he intended to leave it, so that he could model the edges with and into the background. The hills of paint vanished from the palette, yet there was no heaviness on the canvas. Although the shadow was painted as heavily as the light, it retained its transparency. If you see a thing transparent, paint it transparent, don't get the effect by a thin stain showing the canvas through. That's a mere trick. The more delicate the transition, the more you must study it for the exact tone. The lightness and certainty of his touch was marvelous to behold. Never was there any painter who could indicate a mouth with more subtlety, with more mobility, or with keener differentiation. As he painted it, the mouth bloomed out of the face, an integral part of it, not, as in the great majority of portraits, painted on it, a separate thing. He showed how much could be expressed in painting the form of the brow, the cheekbones, and the moving muscles around the eyes and mouth, where the character betrayed itself most readily, and under his hands, a head would be an amazing likeness long before he had so much as indicated the features themselves. In fact, it seemed to me the mouth and nose just happened with the modeling of the cheeks, and one eye, living luminous, had been placed in the socket so carefully prepared for it, like a poached egg dropped on a plate. He described the process, when a clock in the neighborhood struck and Mr. Sargent was suddenly reminded that he had a late appointment with a sitter. In his absorption he had quite forgotten it. He hated to leave the canvas. If only one had oneself under perfect control, one could always paint a thing, finally in one sitting. Not that you are to attempt this. If you work on a head for a week without indicating the features, you will have learnt something about the modeling of the head. Every brush stroke while he painted had modeled the head or further simplified it. He was careful to insist that there were many roads to Rome, that beautiful painting would be the result of any method or no method, but he was convinced that by the method he advocated, and followed all his life, a freedom could be acquired, a technical mastery that left the mind at liberty to concentrate on a deeper or more subtle expression. I had previously been taught to paint a head in 3 separate stages, each one repeating, in charcoal, in thin color wash and in paint, the same things. By Sargent's method the head developed by one process. Until almost at the end there were no features or accents, simply a solid shape growing out of and into a background with which it was one. When at last he did put them in, each accent was studied with an intensity that kept his brush poised in midair until eye and hand had steadied to one purpose, and then, bling! The stroke resounded almost like a note of music. It annoyed him very much if the accents were carelessly indicated, without accurate consideration of their comparative importance. They were, in a way, the nails upon which the whole structure depended for solidity. Miss Heinemann subsequently left a study she had made, at Sargent's studio with a note begging him to write, yes or no, according to whether he approved or not. He wrote the next day, I think your study shows great progress, much better values and consequently greater breadth of effect with less monotony in the detail. I still think you ought to paint thicker, paint all the half-tones and general passages quite thick, and always paint one thing into another and not side by side until they touch. There are a few hard and small places where you have not followed this rule sternly enough. A few days later he called. Miss Heinemann's usual model had failed, and she persuaded her chairwoman to sit in instead. Sargent offered to paint the head of the model. This old head was perhaps easier to indicate with its prominent forms, but the painting was more subtle. I recall my astonishment when he went into the background with a most brilliant pure blue where I had seen only unrevealed darkness. Don't you see it? The way the light quivers across it? I had not perceived it, just as, until each stroke emphasized his intention. I did not see how he managed to convey the thin hair stretched tightly back over the skull without actually painting it. He painted light or shadow, a four-cornered object with the corners worn smooth, as definite in form as it was indefinite in color, and inexpressibly delicate in its transitions. He concentrated his whole attention upon the middle tone that carried the light into the shadow. He kept up a running commentary of explanation as he went, appraising each stroke, often condemning it and saying, that is how not to do it. Keep the planes free and simple. He drew a full, large brush down the whole contour of a cheek, obliterating apparently all the modeling underneath, but it was always further to simplify that he took these really dreadful risks, smiling at my ill-concealed perturbation and quite sympathizing with it. The second painting taught me that the whole values of a portrait depends upon its first painting, and that no tinkering can ever rectify an initial failure. Provided every stage is correct, a painter of Mr. Sargent's caliber could paint for a week on one head and never retrace his steps, but he never attempted to correct one. He held that it was as impossible for a painter to try to repaint a head where the understructure was wrong, as for a sculptor to remodel the features of a head that has not been understood in the mass. That is why Mr. Sargent often repainted the head a dozen times. He told me that he had done no less than 16 of Mrs. Hammersley. When he was dissatisfied he never hesitated to destroy what he had done. He spent 3 weeks, for instance, painting Lady D'Abernon in a white dress. One morning, after a few minutes of what was to be the final setting, he suddenly set to work to scrape out what he had painted. The present portrait in a black dress was done in 3 sittings. He did the same with the portrait of Mrs. Wedgwood, and many others. Miss Eliza Wedgwood relates that in 1896 he consented, at the insistence of Alfred Parsons, to paint her mother. She sat for him 12 times, but after the 12th sitting he said they would both be the better for a rest. He then wrote to Miss Wedgwood that he was humiliated by his failure to catch the variable and fleeting charm of her mother's personality that looked like the end of the portrait. Some weeks later he saw Mrs. Wedgwood at Broadway, and struck with a new aspect he said, "If you will come up next week we will finish that portrait." She came to Tite Street, a new canvas was produced, and in 6 sittings he completed the picture which was shown at the memorial exhibition. Paint 100 studies, keep any number of clean canvases ready, of all shapes and sizes so that you are never held back by the sudden need of one. You can't do sketches enough. Sketch everything and keep your curiosity fresh. Though it was excellent practice to paint flowers, for the precision necessary in the study of their forms and the pure brilliancy of their color. It refreshed the tone of one's indoor portraits, he insisted, to paint landscapes or figures out of doors, as well as to change one's medium now and then. He disliked pastel, it seemed to him too artificial, or else it was made to look like oil or watercolor, and in that case why not use oil or watercolor? Upon one occasion, after painting for me, he saw one hard edge, and drew a brush across it, very lightly, saying at the same time, "This is a disgraceful thing to do, and means slovenly painting. Don't ever let me see you do it." I have also seen the assertion that he painted a head always in one sitting. He painted a head always in one process, but that could be carried over several sittings. He never attempted to repaint one eye or to raise or lower it, for he held that the construction of a head prepared the place for the eye, and if it was wrongly placed, the understructure was wrong, and he ruthlessly scraped and repainted the head from the beginning. That is one reason why his brushwork looks so fluent and easy. He took more trouble to keep the unworried look of a fresh sketch than many a painter puts upon his whole canvas. Well, there you have it. Lesson from the master. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please check out my channel for more art video lessons and more. Thanks for watching.